James Shepard is the founder and chairman of the Shepard Center in Atlanta, a treatment center for patients with spinal cord and brain injuries. He received a Distinguished Public Service Award in 2007 from the American Academy of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation. He was a board member and founding sponsor for the 1996 Paralympic Games. He was, in 2009, a guest of President Barack Obama at the White House for the signing of the Christopher and Dana Reeve Paralysis Act, and a delegate to the White House Conference on Handicapped Individuals. The Shepard Center held the first human embryonic stem cell clinical trial last October. And after earning a Ph.D. in neuroscience from Yale University, Father Tad did postdoctoral research at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School. He studied in Rome, where he studied advanced bioethics, and has testified before a number of state legislatures during deliberations over stem cell research, has served on roundtables on contemporary ethics throughout the US, Canada, and Europe, and made numerous media appearances, including CNN International, ABC World News, and NPR. He is the Director of Education for the National Catholic Bioethics Center in Philadelphia. Again, I'd like to thank our speakers for joining us, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Erin Levine, a professor in the School of Public Policy, who will be moderating for us.
Thank you. A little awkward, I will be talking to you, but looking the other way for just a minute. I want to welcome all of you. I appreciate everyone coming, and I certainly appreciate our speakers coming as well. My role here is quite simple. I am going to try to keep our speakers talking for about the right amounts of time, not let them go on too long, and then take your questions. And that mainly I want to say, you all should have an index card by your seat. If anything one of the speakers says raises your curiosity or something you want to talk more about later on, jot down a question. We'll have a break about halfway through where we can pass questions to the middle, collect them, and then I will be asking them of our speakers. Ideally, if you have questions that are appropriate for both speakers, that will be easiest, but I realize in some cases a question might be more appropriate for one or the other. And if you want to direct a question to a specific speaker, please feel free to do that as well. And a final note, in part this event is for students here. I'm hoping there's lots of questions from everyone, but if you want to indicate on your question that you're a student, I might pull that to the top of the pile, just in the case that we have an enormous list of questions that we don't get to go through. So that is all I will say for now. And with that, I will turn it over to James Shepard, who will be our first speaker. We have about 12 minutes or so for his opening remarks.
Or 8 or 6. Test. Are we on? There we go. And you all are going to have to bear with me. I don't have a loud voice to start with. I'm getting over a cold from about 4 weeks. So if you can't hear, speak up and tell me, and I'll make a little extra effort to dig deeper in the diaphragm. Shepard Center developed a philosophy on our research when the opportunity came to participate in some macrophage cell research with an Israeli firm. And macrophage cells are not stem cells of any type. They're the little Pac-Men of the body that go in and clean up and start. And we did a trial with that about 6 years ago, but we came up with a statement that says Shepard Center supports basic and applied research efforts that are scientifically sound, safeguard the welfare of research participants, and have the potential to advance the field of rehabilitation medicine. Now, we got excited about the opportunity to participate in the first ever embryonic stem cell trial, one of the presidentially grandfathered lines that exist, in conjunction with Geron Corporation and Dr. Hans Kerstead out of Reeve Irvine. Everything we do, whether it's in the efforts around stem cells, or it's in nursing, or it's in therapy, or it's in physician treatment, it rotates around evidence-based medicine. We look at it to make sure that it is efficacious, effective, and improves the care from where we are. We tend to be Switzerland on whether the regenerative research is an embryonic stem cell, an adult stem cell, or cord blood cells. As long as one of those has the potential and possibility to improve the lives of our patients, we're going to pursue it under the guidelines and rigor of the FDA and the NIH. it was interesting. We were able to recruit the first patient into the embryonic stem cell trial back in October. And that individual, after going through all the tests and things and screening, and there are 32 pages of inclusion-exclusion criteria, came up and that evening said, "No, I don't want to." And our screening team walked back downstairs. The next morning he asked him to come back up, and he said, "I thought about it last night, I prayed about it, and God told me I should do it." Now this trial is not one for regenerative research at all. This is strictly a safety trial, which means to prove that there's no harm done. And it's not one to regrow spinal cord tissue. It's one to remyelinate, hopefully, the area of the spinal cord that's been damaged, and maybe the neurons will grow on their own. So this has been 6 months at this point. We've seen no adverse effects in this individual, and he comes back very regularly for testing and all kind of scans. Our belief is that all these cells are similar in nature, even though they've got different sources, and that the embryonic blastocyst that's there is not a fetus. It's the location that makes something become a fetus. And my personal belief, and most of the people at the center, is that until those cells implant into the wall of the uterus, they do not have the opportunity to become a human being. So that's where we base our beliefs and our practice on, and that's where we've gone. I think when we had the trial, it made the paper for several days, made the national news because it was a first in human. We had one volunteer that quit because she said her beliefs didn't allow her to even facilitate in this kind of thing. Then we lost no donors, but we gained about $750,000 in donations over the next 3 weeks. So it was an interesting reaction. There's a lot of anecdotal things going on about, well, OEG cells out of your nose, the work, and they're doing things. Well, we pre-screened 8 patients who went to Portugal to see Dr. Carlos Lima. And they were screened by people that were certified to do clinical trials or do muscle and sensory tests for the Paralympic Games. All came back as Asia A, complete injuries. They came back, they had to commit to at least a year of very intensive therapy post-procedure, and out of all 8, we saw 0 with any change at all. So it was interesting. There's been a lot of anecdotals of people are walking and things like that. We had 2, one that went over there was Christy, and one that didn't was Cindy. They were both in parallel in the very intensive therapy. Both saw some improvements in ability to sit, breathe, and stay in their chair. Both were C4s, meaning no arm movement. Christy finally ran out of money and couldn't afford to stay any longer. She's back struggling some with voice and sitting. Cindy is still raising money on her own, coming in, and she's actually been able to get enough shoulder and other to move her hand over and drive her wheelchair. So it looks like the therapy may have been responsible for more than the cellular piece. You know, no one's got anything that's proof one way or the other. The interesting one is that most of the trials out there that we're seeing or that haven't even rolled out yet are trying to focus on the acute injury, because the belief is you can intervene more in the early stages than you can later. Dr. Wise Young up at Rutgers is actually going to try and get a trial. He's been working for 5 years now to use cord blood for chronic or injuries that are more than 1 year out. And we've been trying to help him locate a funding source in that, because we think there's so many people that are chronic that have become very willing to participate in trials, a lot more so than the new injury. The new injury, while sometimes desperate, still has reservations because they haven't had time to study this. They're dealing with their injury and many other issues. And we struggle with the consent issue, the informed consent, because the trial we are engaged in now, you have to consent and have all the consent take place, arrive here in Atlanta on the 7th day post-injury, and have the procedure before the 14th day. So it's really a stretch to do these. Ultimately, if any of these work, cord, adult, embryonic, they're going to be done in the trauma centers around the country, because you're just not going to have time to do this. We've committed a lot of resources to fly people in at our expense. I mean, they're paying for their regular rehab, but nothing in the study are they charged for. There's a ton of charlatan stuff out there, and part of our role as a rehab center is to look at that. There's a guy in the Dominican Republic that will inject embryonic stem cells into your abdomen, and they'll find their way to your injury. We haven't seen anyone come back from there yet that allowed us to retest them. So there's another guy in Texas who's a physician who will meet you in Mexico and take $125,000 of your dollars and give you embryonic cells. So far, none of those are out there. My acid test, a lot of people say, well, you know, embryonic cells have never been tried before or don't work. And that's not true. They've never been tried until this trial in spinal cord injury. If you want the acid test, go to clinicaltrials.gov. If it's been done in the U.S. under the rigors of the FDA, it will be listed on that site. So I kind of discard a lot of the anecdotal, well, this guy, you know, was up and walking, and, you know, this one went to the Dominican Republic, is now doing marathons, and I've met that young lady. She was incomplete before she went to the Dominican. I think my acid test is I want to see those people up on Good Morning America, the Today Show, or some of those dancing across the stage screaming, it worked. And so far, I haven't seen that. So it's interesting. We look at the embryo and the ethical piece as everyone's personal choice. I know there are a lot of people that would believe that the fertilization, when the egg and sperm combine, brings conception. I just don't happen to believe it. There was a Harris poll done back in the summer of 2010, and it came up with results that said roughly 70% of our nation, Catholic, non-Catholic, favor embryonic stem cell research when the couple has unused cells left over that they're not going to use. And rather than discard them, or rather than give those cells to someone to raise what might be a child, to someone unknown, they'd rather donate them to science for research. The Catholics for Choice come up with a similar, where the Catholics actually favor, in about 68% of the time, using these cells in this way. When you drill down, if you ask a simple question, do you favor life? I think you're going to get nearly 100% answer of yes, we do. I mean, I favor life. I also favor quality of life. And when I look at these cells, in some ways I see that maybe this is the ultimate organ donation. The attempted in vitro fertilization hopefully results in a pregnancy or 2 or 3 for the couple. And then they're able to take the unused ones that have never attached to the wall of the uterus and let those become a cell or maybe a piece of an organ to help change someone's quality of life. I don't know how many of you have come and been around people with spinal cord injuries, which are when they're a complete injury or have no function below the level of injury. And the indignities that they go through every day, unable to control their bowel, their bladder, their sexual function, can't feel any of their limbs below that level. So to me, even if I were struggling with it, and I'm really not, I would think my compassion would maybe overrule that. And a lot of people, that isn't going to happen. So it's something you need to look at. You need to listen. Father Tad's great on the other side. He's got some great, salient, valid points. And I'd welcome your questions afterwards, and looking for a great exchange today. Thanks.
I won't turn my microphone on. I was just going to thank James for getting us started, and I'm going to turn it over to Father Tad, who will have 12 minutes or so for his opening statement.
Okay. Thank you very much, James, for your intervention. I'd like to just begin by, expressing the validity of the sentiment that says whatever works should be pursued. But the critical point there is whatever works and is ethical should be pursued. Everybody, I think, understands that when science, which is a tremendous power, moves into unethical terrain, that it becomes a threat to all of us. So I would, preface all of my remarks with that overview, that we really have to care, and care deeply, about science being ethical. I'm going to run a short video clip here. Our center asked a news reporter to come in and interview different staff members. And in particular, on the question of frozen embryos, she kind of grilled me, and I wanted to share this with you as a launch point for our discussion.
In the whole area of embryonic stem cell research, the argument that's made by a lot of government leaders is simply that if we don't use these embryos, they're going to be discarded. Let's listen to President Obama and to the head of the National Institute of Health.
We are going to discard those embryos, and we know that there's potential research that could lead to curing debilitating diseases, Alzheimer's, Lou Gehrig's disease. If that possibility presents itself, then I think that we should, in a careful way, go ahead and pursue that research.
Ethically, isn't it more justifiable if those embryos have been created to use them for a purpose that might help somebody with the disease as opposed to simply discarding them? All of the lines that were approved today were derived, in fact, from those excess embryos that otherwise would have been discarded.
So what's your reaction to what they have to say?
The issue is, of course, that this act of discarding is not discarding an inanimate object. We have a whole different scenario here that we're talking. This is not like taking sliced vegetables and dumping them in the trash. So we say, well, the embryos are all going to be discarded. At that point, we've got to pause and say, hold on, what's actually involved here? And the bottom line is, the hard truth here is that it isn't just an act of discarding embryos. It's actually an act of destroying them. In fact, those medical staff who are involved in this become, in effect, the executioners of these embryos. So, when we actually step back and say, all right, this is part and parcel of what we mean by discarding human embryos, then we can say, well, is this the right direction for us to be going? And, there was an interesting article that was published in the New York Times a few years back, and it was called "The Job That No One Wants at the Fertility Clinics." And what was that job? The job was precisely the job of destroying these embryos, of throwing them away. Clinic workers would say, you do it. No, you do it. They would try to pass the buck. And in some cases, I remember reading about a clinic operator in Chicago. He had to do it himself because none of his staff was willing to step up and do this. And as the procedure is done, it's fascinating. They go through very, very careful paperwork in triplicate to be sure that it's this precise embryo that is being discarded, not the other ones, because if they throw away the other ones, they might be throwing away the children of a family who would be extremely upset, fully aware that these are their children who were being violated in this fashion.
But there are a lot of people who argue that an embryo is not yet a human life.
The fact is that all of us are embryos who have grown up. And those clinic operators who are hesitant to throw away those embryos, they know it. They see it clearly because they take those very embryos, implant them into women's uteri, and see beautiful, bubbly children who are born, who bring happiness and joy to those families. So there's no question in their minds as to what they're dealing with. The argument that embryos aren't human beings is one of those convenient fictions. It's a kind of euphemism that we all play with in order to justify certain desirable, other actions that we might like to take. And again, the desire here is a good one. We want to find cures and treatments for people who are sick, and stem cell research is marketed in this way, that, if we go after these embryos, who will be discarded anyway, then we'll have all these wonderful benefits. But I like to think of it another way as well. These embryos who are in the deep freeze, they're in kind of frozen orphanages. Now, if you think of it in that term, and then also think of a regular orphanage, and just make a kind of hypothetical scenario here. Let's say you have a regular orphanage with infants who are maybe between 1 and 3 years of age. For one reason or another, they may have been abandoned by their parents, and they're there in the hopes that some of them will be adopted. Let's say you had an unscrupulous operator of one of these clinics, and one of these orphanages, and he says, we're going to take those children who, in my judgment, are unlikely to ever be adopted, and we're going to toss them into the dumpster out back. Now, everybody would react with abhorrence to something like that. It's a natural reaction we see immediately. that's not the proper thing to do. And if anybody was to go one step further and say, look, they're all going to be thrown away anyway. Let's get some good out of those children. We're going to be thrown into the dumpster, maybe through transplantation, through basic medical research on those infants before they die. Again, abhorrence, an immediate connection. But those frozen orphanages are a parallel case, only simply younger children. And the decision to take any of them and throw them in the dumpster should elicit the same sense of abhorrence. But somehow we manage to kind of sanitize and step away from it and depersonalize it by talking about embryos as if they are objects to be manipulated. I think that the issues that are raised here by the frozen embryos, are very significant ones. And I think in particular it's important to emphasize that the idea that an embryo somehow undergoes some kind of mystical, magical change upon implantation is another one of these convenient fictions that we do choose to advert to suggest that somehow there is an essential change in the substance that we are dealing with upon that occurrence, rather than recognizing the fact that we're dealing with an unbroken continuum that is established at fertilization and continues until you reach the point of, as I like to say, the adult taxpayer. And along the way, you just have milestones. Implantation happens to be one of those milestones. Birth is another one. Graduation from law school may be another one. And those are not relevant in terms of actually assessing what it is that we're dealing with, in the sense that there's no critical substantial change that takes place. So this idea that the embryo is whatever I want it to be. It's my personal choice. I can make it up as I go along. This kind of thinking is so hard to stomach for anybody who has been trained rigorously in the sciences. You know that objective reality doesn't just bend under your will. Objective reality speaks to you about its structure. And for us to, in a sense, make that move, something almost of a move of pride, to suggest that this entity in front of me is what I'm going to say it is, I think, an act of ultimate intellectual dishonesty. So I think the other issue that comes up here that James brought out very well, he said, you know, his center at the beginning had a kind of policy statement, the Shepherd Center, about the welfare of research participants. And of course, that's critical in any good ethics. Research participants must be protected. And so it's the ultimate irony that it is his center that is allowing research upon human subjects without their consent, without proper consent that is in any way able to be obtained. Because remember, the embryo himself or herself cannot consent. You can't ask mom and dad for consent either. Why not? Well, because in order for parents to give informed consent that is valid for their own children, they have to have the best interests of the child in mind. They can never hand their children over to be destroyed by others. That proves that they do not have the best interests of the child in mind. And therefore they cannot give valid consent for embryonic stem cell research. So all the consent forms that are filled out represent another one of these fictions that we generate in order to attempt to justify certain practices that raise incontrovertible moral difficulties. How much time do we have? Okay, let me just close by sharing with you a quote that I have found to be right on the mark in this discussion. This is from Dr. Leon Kass. Some of you may be familiar with Dr. Kass. He's a Jewish ethicist, MD, Ph.D., University of Chicago. He was head of President Bush's Council on Bioethics for a number of years. And I think he put it really crisply. He said, to seize the occasion, you must, as the late Paul Ramsey said, raise the ethical questions with a serious and not a frivolous conscience. A man of frivolous conscience announces that there are ethical quandaries ahead that we must urgently consider before the future catches up with us. By this, he often means that we need to devise a new ethics that will provide the rationalization, for doing in the future what men are bound to do because of new actions and interventions science will have made possible. In contrast, a man of serious conscience means to say, in raising urgent ethical questions, that there may be some things that men should never do. The good things that men do can be made complete only by the things they refuse to do. These are powerful words, I think, in a technocratically oriented society like this one, but they are words, I am convinced, of great wisdom.
Thank you. With the structure of the debate, though, now will be roughly 5 minutes or so for James to respond to any elements of Father Tad that he wants to, or raise his own points, and then 5 minutes for Father Tad. I remind you one more time, this is a good time to be thinking about your questions and jotting them down, so we'll have questions for the second half of the debate. James.
I think some of the things I'd like to bring forth to you all are that absolutely the attachment to the uterus is required for a birth or for an embryo. To say that the two cells that are fertilized blastocysts are children is a stretch for me. I just cannot get there based on what I have looked at, studied, and known. Maybe not as deeply educated as Father Tad is, but I can tell you I just can't get there. Even when we look at the cloning of Dolly the sheep, those cells were implanted in the uterus of another sheep to give the platform and the next step to become an embryo. Those cells in the dish have no neurological midline, they have no brain cells, they have no heart tissue in the early stages that their research is done on. And they won't ever develop those in that dish. It's really interesting when you consider the dilemma of do you think those are children or not. Let's say you're in a daycare center and you can only choose one of these. There are 10 dishes with fertilized blastocysts, children if you will, and there are 2 5-year-olds in the room. The daycare center catches on fire. You can only either take the 2 5-year-olds or the other dishes. Which do you take? Is it a child? Would you really grab those dishes? I wouldn't, and I couldn't. So I think it's misleading to say that these are children, because for me they're just simply not.
Thank you, James. We'll turn over 5 minutes or so for Father Tad.
Thank you, James. The example that you raise, I want to just address briefly about the situation where you've got the fire in the clinic, you have a tank full of embryos, and you've got one infant. Fire is raging, you can only grab one or the other. And of course, everybody would grab the baby. I mean, that's the immediate reaction we have. So ipso facto, conclusion, putatively, the embryos aren't human. That is a total non sequitur. What that example beautifully illustrates is what we are familiar with. We're familiar with seeing certain things. People with faces, people with, who have developed, who have grown up. We're not used to seeing embryos. We're not supposed to see embryos. They belong in women's uteri and nowhere else in their reproductive systems, not in tanks, frozen, not on lab benches, being sliced and diced. They're totally ectopic in that setting, totally out of where they should be. Now, why do I say it's about the familiarity thing here? Here, take this example. Fire's raging in the clinic. 2 beds. In one, you have 2 beautiful young girls who are your daughters. In the other one, you have your wife. You only have time to choose one. You happen to grab the one with your wife, and your 2 daughters perish in the fire. It says nothing about the value of your 2 daughters. It says that you have constructed a hypothetical situation that does not at all impinge on the fundamental ethical question that is at stake. So these kinds of thought experiments are nice for academicians, but they miss the essential questions that are raised here about who human embryos really are, and about the kinds of science that none of us should engage in. I mean, you know, the proposal that scientists should not engage in certain kinds of research, I understand why so many scientists don't like to hear that. Scientists are creative by nature. I was in the lab for years. I spent whole nights over Petri dishes and over 96-well microtiter plates. I know what it's like. It's a passionate drive that we all have. But every passionate drive must be tempered by proper principles, by a sense of what is right and wrong, precisely because science is one of the most powerful elements in our society today. It's one of the most respected of institutions. And when it goes bad, as it did in Germany during the last World War, it was a horrible dark spot upon the entire field. The kind of science that occurred there in the name of good ends. And that same danger looms as we face today the serious questions surrounding the use of human embryos. How much time do we have?
You have a couple minutes.
Couple minutes. All right. Let me just say a little bit more on the issue of the ultimate organ donation that James brought up in the first part, which I think, you know, is sometimes a tempting heading to view this under. Organ donation by nature requires a free choice. And the proposal that the embryo could be making an ultimate organ donation fails precisely because of the lack of informed consent. I think it's important to be clear about that notion. And let me just maybe close then on the argument that James raised again about implantation. That basically the argument is if you implant the embryo, if you don't implant the embryo no longer can really grow, no longer can really become what it is destined to become. Now, that's true insofar as you kind of look at it prima facie on first level. But again, I hope you see the profound difficulty with that argument, which is that's the same argument as saying, hey, if I take an infant, lock that infant into a room, prevent that child from being able to get to the maternal breast for nourishment, throw away the key, that infant will die. All right, well, because of that fact, then that implies that it's not really a human being. No, it implies you've deprived that living human being who has certain organismic requirements of what he or she needs in order to grow. Precisely the same thing that is done when you cryopreserve these human embryos. So this does not in any way describe accurately the essence of the entity under consideration. It only reminds us that embryos, like all of us actually, are incredibly dependent beings.
Thank you. That will conclude the first portion of this debate. We've heard two very different perspectives on human embryonic stem cell research, and I'm hoping we have inspired many of you to write questions. So there'll be a brief pause, a couple minutes, while you can either write something down or pass it to the center, and then let me look through, sort these questions, and we'll resume in just a few minutes and begin asking the questions of our two panelists. We should reconvene since we have quite a collection of questions. We will get started. Just a note, both of the speakers have agreed to spend a little bit of time after we close. We're going to try to close as near to 4 as possible. We'll probably be a little bit after 4. But if students in particular have a few questions that aren't able to get answered during this Q&A session, the speakers have agreed to be able to address those one-on-one afterwards. Because you have written many good questions, and I don't think we're going to get through all of them in the time allotted. So we're going to start. Since the microphone is making noises, can you hear me if I speak? Great. the first question, the questions will address to both speakers, although I've given them the option, if they feel their statements have already clearly answered that one, to just let the other speaker address it. Here, a student question. The debaters have spent a great deal of time talking about the definition of child or human. Would they please address the concept of human suffering as a metric for evaluating this issue? i.e., does embryonic stem cell research have a net increase or a net decrease in suffering?
You want me to go first?
Go ahead. We can alternate.
Okay. Yeah, that's a very important question. Raising the question of suffering is critical here. And I think one's whole approach to suffering is interwoven into this. So the question, does embryonic stem cell research offer the potential to alleviate some suffering? Well, of course it does. Assuming it were to work, which is likely to occur, I always say to people, look, if you throw enough $1 or $1 billion at any problems, you'll be able to usually make them work. Scientists and people who are pushing technology are very resolute in trying to see projects through to their finality. So it may work, and it may then provide a therapeutic outcome that is a kind of benefit to some patients. But the question about sum total of suffering, the way that the question was phrased, is a question that is, in a sense, misphrased. There is no way to sum up suffering. If you say somebody is struggling in the depths of a deep depression, how are you going to line that up to some other kind of suffering, like a headache, and tell me, which one is quantitatively more? Now, as scientists, one would like to have some metric, but the root issue is suffering is an internal, inner reality that touches on our subjectivity in a very important way. And there's no possibility of writing some kind of equation where you are trying to maximize benefit and minimize suffering for the entire universe. Because we don't have all the variables, we don't have anywhere near the proper variables to be able to do that. That's the kind of equation that only the Lord God can write, if such an equation is possible at all. So suffering here is going to be able to be affected in some local fashion, but then the other problem is at what cost? And that's where the ethics step in. If it is at the cost of ending the life of another fellow human being, a brother and sister to you and me, that is already a kind of price that is far too high.
Well, I don't know that there's a formula for suffering. I know that when I talk to people who have spent 2, 5, 10, 25 years in wheelchairs, they would tell you that this opportunity is not about walking at that point in their life. It's about the possibility of restoration of bowel and bladder control as a huge leap for them, which is, in their mind, and I think the individual has to be the one that evaluates whether they're suffering. Not an outside panel, not some formula. I think it's something that you as an individual, with your God, come to an understanding that if you were to leave this earth, you would be proud to meet him and be judged on that decision. And that's between you and your God. It's not between people with different beliefs and you trying to impose their beliefs on you. Everyone's got their own. You may be pro-abortion, you may be anti-abortion. If I happen to be anti-abortion, it gives me no right to impose my views on you as a human being. If you're comfortable that when you leave this earth and meet your Maker, that decision will be okay between him and you, then I have no business interfering in it.
James, could I respond? Just briefly, very briefly, because this is one of the most seductive arguments that he just deployed, which is this is all about different religious persuasions. You guys have your morality, I have mine. Some people think abortion is okay, some people don't. Some people think slavery is okay, some people don't. Doesn't work, right? There are objective truths that govern what we do. Some people think, you know, shooting people or breaking into banks to steal money is okay, others don't. Doesn't work. Morality doesn't work that way. It'd be convenient if we could make it up as we went along, as James is implying. But we can't. We have to have a shared code of behavior. We have to have a commonality of our language. And these are fundamental truths that touch on us. And one of the most basic ones is, I should not hurt you, you should not hurt me. You and I were both embryos at one point. We should not be harming others even when they're very young.
Okay, I'm going to, in the interest of asking and addressing as many questions as possible, we'll try to keep answers to no more than 2 minutes, maybe a minute to 2 should be the target, and I'll be flashing signs at you. Both of you are welcome to answer this, although I think it might be a little bit more for Father Tad. What should be done with the frozen embryos that are in storage already? The 400,000 to 1 million or whoever that are in storage in the United States, should they be kept in storage indefinitely, or is there some other solution?
Do you want me to start?
If you have a take, you're welcome.
Mine's very short, you so.
Well, why don't you go first?
All right, in less than a minute and a half, the evidence out there shows that there is a finite life for those frozen embryos, and at some point they expire anyway. So once you freeze them, you've already made that decision, unless you use them relatively quickly.
Yeah, my reply would be very similar, actually, in the sense that there are no morally legitimate uses for embryos that are in the deep freeze, because you can't use other humans. That's always an ethical problem. So the frozen embryos need to remain frozen. That's about as good as we can get in terms of according them some measure of respect that they are due. And in time, they will die, presumably from a kind of freezer burn, you know, like your steaks get in the freezer over time. And then they could be given a decent burial, and the matter could be left there.
Okay, a scientific question, and a science we haven't gotten into in quite as much detail yet, but this question says, do somatic cells, so cells of the body that have been induced to become pluripotent and can therefore generate a new organism, do they deserve protection as a human embryo? Or are they suitable for research, presumably is the other side of the question.
I would say they're suitable for research just like the others. Neither are children or human.
Okay, and I would say that I agree with the first part of what James said, and I disagree with the second. The first part is that when you make induced pluripotent stem cells, you are making stem cells. You are not creating an organism. So there is not this fundamental ethical conundrum that is raised. Meanwhile, when you prepare embryonic stem cells, you are disaggregating an organismic structure, a structure that is set and intent with an orientation to become an adult. So the research with the induced pluripotent stem cells is a very suitable and semi-parallel alternative. Now I say semi-parallel because those of you who have studied the biology of this, you know that there's a great deal that remains to be done in terms of characterization of the genetic changes that are involved here. And reprogramming is not a trivial matter. We are almost clueless. It's a big black box at this stage of the game. And there are, you know, some questions about imprinting and memory effects in these cells based on their source, many other things. So it's not a perfect parallel, but is it ethically permissible? The short answer is yes. Induced pluripotent stem cells do not raise this problem.
Okay, another question. In the normal reproductive process, when a fertilized egg was not attached to the womb and then gets flushed down the toilet, is that a human being flushed down the toilet? If so, is this acceptable? Why does God permit this? We'll address this to you. I think, though, why does God permit this?
That was not mine.
The direction. Just interpretation, sorry.
Do you want to?
Not mine.
Okay.
I didn't believe it was a human to begin with, so
All right, yeah, the issue of what's called wastage, that's the term that's typically used here. And there's an indication that maybe as much as as many as half of the embryos that are engendered in normal marital relations are lost. Just lost, they don't attach, or there are other difficulties where they don't develop properly. Does this say anything about what is the nature of the being? Well, not really. It just says that to become a human, you've got a lot of milestones. You don't always make all those milestones. There also are children who die at birth. You know, that's another instance where they don't continue. They can't nurse, they can't, whatever the particular anomaly is that precludes them from continuing to grow. It doesn't say anything about the fact whether they're a child or not. I mean, that is established from the biology. So the question of why does God allow this? Well, I'd suggest, you know, questions about why God does what God does are questions that I recommend that you hold till the afterlife. These are questions of, you know, very great depth that very few of us actually have much handle on. It's like the question of why is there suffering? And there's a good reason for it, but, you know, it's very mysterious if you actually begin to plumb it. And those of you who come from a Christian background, you know there's a whole theology of suffering and of death on the cross of the one who saved the world. So this is not a trivial matter, and I don't think, you know, I can answer questions about why God does what he does.
Okay, we will have questions that are specifically directed at the panelists now. I'll start with a question that's been directed by a student to James. Embryos can be represented by other unformed living things, seeds, tadpoles, etc. If an embryo had more survivability outside the womb, if presumably implantation wasn't as required, would you consider an embryo then a human being?
No, I think I would go back to something Father Tad just said, that, you know, in the wastage you just had an interruption in the process. And I would just say those that don't make it to being implanted in the womb have just had their process interrupted.
Do you have a reaction to this question, or do you want to move on to the question directed to you?
So just rephrase it, just the key part of it again.
The key part, if the embryo had more survivability, so
Okay,
it could survive
yeah.
outside of, without implantation.
Yeah, let me address that. Because I think that what is going to happen in time, we will have artificial uteri. It'll be completely possible to do this once we understand how placentas attach and how nutrient exchange occurs. It's just a matter of time and technology. We all know that. This is just a very complex system that we got to sort out. So conceptually, it will be perfectly possible to bring embryos from fertilization up to the point of autonomous existence. It's just, you know, time until that occurs. So again, that just reminds us of the nature of the entity. I mean, this is not something that's going to turn into a cat or a zebra or a plant or an oak tree, but we know what it's going to become because it's written right into its very essence at the beginning.
Your comment actually leads right into the question that was directed to you.
Okay.
You said you consider an embryo to be a human. Do you consider an acorn to be an oak tree?
I don't, that's a great question. I don't consider an acorn to be an oak tree. However, this is the critical point. An acorn is an oak in precisely the same way that an oak tree is an oak. The only way an acorn can become an oak tree is because it shares in that same continuity of being. It is already oak. Oak that is very young, and soon it will grow. It will elicit branches, leaves. It will start photosynthesizing and doing wonderful things. But precisely because of what that acorn was ab initio, from the get-go. It is not going to ever turn into a zebra or anything else.
We're rapidly running close to the end of our hour. Let's go back to a question that I think gets to some of the main points of both of your initial arguments. A student wanted to know, is there a scientific argument for whether or not an embryo is human or not? So we'll let you start with your perspective and let James.
Is there a scientific argument that an embryo is human? Well, of course there is. This is a purely scientific affirmation. I mean, what else could it be? I've been emphasizing, it's not an oak tree, it's not a zebra. We have the telos. You just look at it, provide it with the right kinds of nutrients and circumstances, it grows in front of you and becomes what you and I are. becomes an adult, becomes one who can balance his checkbook. It's just a matter of time and nourishment. Science establishes this. This is not something that requires personal opinions. You go in there and you act against the integrity of that being, you destroy a future individual. That's why people choose abortions. They don't want to have a future individual who they have to raise, take care of, be responsible for. You know, they acknowledge that this is what's coming. There's no doubt of what it is. They're not aborting an oak tree. So this is something that science establishes. This is why this whole issue is the most basic and the most important human rights issue of our times. There is no other human rights issue that is of greater significance than this one, because this is our brothers and sisters who are in the firing line.
You know, I mean, I'm not as well versed in science as Father Tad may be, but to me, until those cells that are dividing and sitting there do get into a uterus or an artificial uterus one day, I don't think it'll be my lifetime based on how slow I've seen some stuff move in the embryonic field, but it just can't become, it's not a human at that point. And absent the artificial or the real uterus, it will never become a life. So it's not a brother, it's not a sister, it's not a cousin. It just is cells that are dividing.
Okay, well, there are many questions left on my desk here. I see it's already 4 o'clock, and in our format for the debate, we were going to have 3 minutes closing statements, and based on the order we've been going, the first 3-minute closing statement will be Father Tad, and then 3 minutes from James. That will be the conclusion of the debate, and you'll have the opportunity, I think, to ask some of these additional questions individually if you would like to. So I'll give you 3 minutes.
For my closing statement, I'd like to just make use of a quick analogy that I think is helpful here. This is a picture of a human embryo sitting on the point of a pin, and you know, we say it doesn't have hands, doesn't have feet, doesn't look familiar to us. We see a picture like this, a scanning electron micrograph of an 8-cell human embryo. Looks like a cluster of grapes, totally unfamiliar to us. Totally unfamiliar to us. And it's on the basis of that unfamiliarity that we then subject that individual to the violent extraction of stem cell procurement. Well, if we look at a simple analogy that I like to present about the American bald eagle. This bird was endangered for a long time. You remember in 1940, we passed a federal law to protect these birds because they were endangered. You read the text of that law, it says to you, if you're out there with your shotgun and you see one of these birds flying in the sky overhead, you shoot the bird down. You will suffer very stiff legal sanctions and penalties, X, Y, and Z. But it also mentions in that same federal law that if you're out there in the wilderness walking around and you see a nest of the bald eagle, and you find eggs in that nest, and you choose to destroy just one egg, guess what? You suffer the same penalties, X, Y, and Z, as if you had shot the bird out of the air. That makes perfect sense. Everybody understands that. That's completely rational. Why? What is it that's so special about that egg? What's actually inside that egg? It is an embryonic eagle. And even a perfect atheist can appreciate the reasonableness and cogency of a federal law like that. And yet, strangely, the split second that we begin to talk about human embryos, about our own very humble beginnings, we go through all these strange mental somersaults and conniptions, trying our darndest to justify the unjustifiable. So I'll close with this cartoon. The researcher says, harvesting stem cells from human embryos like the one in this petri dish will save lives. And the little guy over here on the right says, not mine. That's what the ethical controversy is swirling around, very legitimately so. Thank you.
Thank you. And 3 minutes for James to make a closing statement.
Well, I think if you look at the eagle, that's an interesting exercise in mental gymnastics, because that egg does not need a womb like a human egg does. So it's not even a fair comparison, not even in the same ballpark. And you want to look at the federal law. that protects that egg. Let's look at the federal law, the Dickey-Wicker Amendment, that outlawed federal funding for embryonic stem cells. Actually, back in November, I invited Senator Wicker to come and spend a day with me, and he did. And he listened. And he said, we don't prevent you from doing what you did, do we? As long as it's privately funded, the federal government doesn't have penalties. So this is a recognition that embraced and says our society has said, through federal law even, that the penalties aren't near like they are for the eagle. So I just don't see that there's a comparison between those two. I think that if you look at the federal protections and the permission that our government has granted to do research with embryonic stem cells with private funding, is a vast difference. The interesting thing I've always asked people that are opposed to embryonic stem cells for research is, if you really believe that that is something that shouldn't happen, do you not have a duty and a responsibility to come up and fund cord blood or bone marrow stem cell research? Because I can tell you this, any group with a disability or disease, adult and juvenile diabetes, ALS, those people will jump at whatever works. So fund the others. The other issue goes away. Make it vanish. Help us.
Well, that concludes our debate. I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking our two speakers.
Thank you.